It's nice to be here again. It's one of my most favorite conferences, especially because I can go upstage with sandals and a couple of shorts and just have a talk. Welcome to my talk. From theory to practice, let's find an iOS commercial spyware sample. For the ones that don't know me, my name is Matthias. I'm co-founder and VP of research at iVerify, and I'm most interested in iOS malware exploitation and finding new and interesting ways to discover threats. So this is actually the third part, kind of in a series, which all started with OBTS version 5 in 2022. And there I told everyone that it's not really possible to detect new and novel malware with an app on iOS, just because you're missing the kind of data sources that you would need. Last year, I showed you what is the actual forensic source that you would need in order to detect threats like Pegasus, Predator, Quadream, so on and so forth. And I showed you many, many examples of how Citizen Lab, Amnesty, and other companies like ourselves did that work. But there is a couple of challenges with forensics data. Like a sysdiagnose takes roughly 10 hours to take. There's lots of user interaction. You need some experts to analyze those. And an iTunes backup is even a lot more painful in that way. So that's good. That was the theory part. But the question is, does that work in practice? Yeah, and that's what I want to talk about today. And before I'll get into the details, I need to thank a couple of organizations and some persons. Especially I want to mention Amnesty International and Citizen Lab here, and just because all of the groundbreaking work those two organizations have done over the last decade and even sometimes longer. Without those organizations, no one would be able to do this kind of threat detection on iOS. This is really, really fundamental, and I would really hope that they keep up the good work. And then I'd like to mention Ian Beer. At some point in time during this year, we kind of teamed up and had to do a small little workshop to find out what this special sample is doing. Unfortunately, Ian can't be here today. But he did some tremendous work around this, and I did wanted to give him credit. The first part of today is going to be a summary of the kind of recent stuff that I did on this, and I'm just going to be very quick here. Who of you did actually looked at my Black Hat talk earlier this year in April? Okay, that's not a lot. For all of the rest, here's the link. I'm going to include in the actual slides that Andy is uploading a lot more details and links so you can follow the whole story. Okay, so where did this all started? It started last year in September when Citizen Lab published their research on a BlastPass exploit chain from Pegasus. This was starting with an iMessage attachment and it targeted a USA-based civil society. This was September. We are now calling this specific threat actor, NSO, we're calling it Rainbow Ronin, and we have a nice little pony to highlight them. You can get some stickers. And in my specific case, actually, my whole story started 6 days after the last OBTS, when a customer reached out with a potentially compromised device. I had a couple of data sources in that case, which were especially crash logs, an iTunes backup, and telemetry data. And when I started to investigate these crashes, I started to immediately see a very interesting pattern. We had 25 crashes of the HomeD process, there was a small break, and then we had 35 crashes of messages blast for service. Each of those individual links would have been enough to spike an investigation, because that is not happening very often. At this time, I was still thinking maybe the threat actor started a first exploit chain, an older one, because there is a Pwn Your Home change for HomeD. And then they moved over to messages blast for service. Later on, I figured out that HomeD actually crashed a lot more than the 25 times, but iOS is not storing more than 25 crash logs, so I could only see that specific part, and now I know that HomeD is deeply linked into that exploit chain. Luckily, I had an entry point, so when I started to look at my backup, I found at this specific point in time a couple of very interesting looking files, which were all called sample.pkpass. Yeah, and I already knew that there was a last exploit chain that used iMessage and passkit attachments, so I thought, damn, that's gold. So I started my exploit analysis, and inside of the sample.pkpass file, you're going to find a logo.png file, which is pretty large. It's actually not a PNG, it's a WebP file, which matches the vulnerability which were closed by Apple. This contains a plist, and in that plist, you will find an object at number 11, which will then contain an NS expression. So what's an NS expression? An NS expression is essentially a way to dynamically execute a couple of different logics. It's built into iOS and macOS since a couple of versions, and with a specific function expression, you can actually execute arbitrary code. So this allows you to bypass any kind of code signing because you can just have your expression string and you can call every single function that is available in the Objective-C runtime, and you can be done with that. This has been abused by Pegasus before in 2021 by a couple of different threat actors. ENB introduced one last year, and it's a very, very common theme now. When I started to look at that NS expression payload, I have 4 different payloads in total. This is a messy slide, but I wanted to give you the structure. And the first payload that afterwards is executed, I call it just payload 1. It was compressed and it was also encoded, so I need to run some magic in order to make it a little bit more visible. Yeah, this is what you can see here. This is still not close from being good. At this time, I had 2,539 lines of NS expression. And I knew this is going to be fun. And this was just the first payload. The sample contained another payload CS, which was actually a config file. It showed us that the exploit was valid between iOS 16.4.1 and iOS 16.6. It didn't contain any iPads. It contained a payload C, which is another NS expression, and it contained 3 other different compressed sub-payloads. My original payload also contained another compressed sub-payload, and I had a payload X, which was another NS expression, but unfortunately was encrypted. So at this point of the analysis, and this is roughly April 2024, I hit a roadblock for this, because I just couldn't recover anything more about this. So that left the chain essentially at this point. I had my NS expression, I had my payload, I had the payload CS, which was a config, the other payload C that was called, and the other payload, and then the payload X. Yeah, and this lists a couple of open questions. How was that NS expression executed? How did they bypass any NS expression mitigations that were introduced by Apple before? What is the encryption key? What is the sandbox escape? What is the command and control structure? What is the implant? And what is the pack bypass that they needed? So if we're looking at that chain, we now know that we have a stage 0, which is actually HomeKit, that isn't analyzed yet. We have a stage 1, which is the WebP. We have a stage 1.5, which is our NS expression that is executed. And then we have a payload X, that is the sandbox escape. And then at some point in time, there's going to be an implant. So at that time, I was also chatting a lot more with Ian, and he's a lot more interested into the first part of the chain, like how the extra code execution got kicked off. And this is what his talk at OffensiveCon in May also focused on. And based on his talk, we now know that there was a heap grown with the logo.png and the background.png and a massive binary plist that then used the CF read stream object to store the job chain. And if you look at the sample in the right format, you can actually very, very clearly see that job chain and some part of what it's trying to do. At the very end of the job chain, you're going to see a couple of strings to CF predicate policy restricted classes, CF predicate policy data, and evaluate with objects. Those strings tell us already how they were able to bypass the restricted classes mitigation that Apple introduced. They were just flipping the switch in memory, and then they could execute that again. So once again, single stack, like a single memory corruption vulnerability still gives you a lot of the stuff, even if there's mitigations. Yeah, so we did know at this time what the job chain was doing, but we still had left like a lot of other open questions. And that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm still pretty good on time. Yeah, so this is where we left off the analysis in April. And this is actually, it's not beautiful, it's not fun to analyze. So at this time, I just said, okay, it's time for some Python magic, and we need to actually find a much, much better way to do this. It took me a couple of weeks, a little bit of research, and actually after that, you get to a very nicely pseudo Objective-C-like structure that you can pretty much analyze. It's not perfect, it will probably not run, but it is definitely good enough to read, and the whole payload with all the sub-payload was now down to like 650 lines. Yeah, that's good enough to read, so let's look into a couple of the things that they're doing with NS expressions. They're using a cast operation to essentially use arbitrary Objective-C methods and arbitrary Objective-C classes. They're loading a couple of libraries to extend the valuable functions, and especially they're using the Office import framework for short-term storage. The problem with NS expressions is you don't have variables available, so you need to improvise. But the Office import framework has a function which is called mapper for current thread, which will always resolve back to the same object, so I can use that dictionary and keys in order to have variables, which is pretty smart. They're using NS predicate utilities for a couple of calculations, and they used 4 different encoding and compression algorithms, and the variables were always stored as those very, very weird names, which is also a great obfuscation. Yeah, and some part was encrypted. They're using ternaries as a control flow structure, and those sub-expressions were essentially used to create recursive function calls to also have some kind of loops. They were also checking how long it took the NS expression to execute, and if they were hitting a certain time, they would just exit messages BlastPass service, so they're not leaving too many traces. The same for a couple of frequency operations, and they used NS predicates to search for a couple of different things. So there was that config that I mentioned that contained a couple of those elements from iPhones. The exact elements that were actually used are the following ones. There's 4, and there's one other part that is mentioned across the code. If you look what they're doing with the config, at the very end, those variables are added together, and those are resolved in a couple of different objects inside of the shared cache. So there's DLSym, there's a smiley with exploding head, and there's the OSLog object. And the last one is actually unused in the part of the code that I have. When you looked at where those config objects were used, it was in a large function which was called prepareConfig, and then afterwards, after the config was prepared, there was a repeated pattern where this also was used. This pattern repeated exactly 24 times. And you can also see here there's a nice little, there's a very, very long variable. And if you look at that variable, this is -2 in hex. And if you look at some of the strings which are also put into a variable, you see there's a call to DLOpen. And then at the very end, there's a DLOpen invocation and the DLOpen implementation that is created. So what NSO wants to do is they want to call specific C functions. Those are not present in messages BlastPass service. That means they need to have a way to use DLSym. But DLSym is not available, so that means they either need to have a pack bypass or they need to have an unfixed call to DLSym. I can tell you that the smiley is one of the most important parts of the pack bypass and how this is used. Unfortunately, due to Patrick's Nerf gun, I'm not able to tell you how that works today. But I'm going to publish a very detailed blog post on that, and I will share a little bit more later this year. A couple of the functions which are prepared are actually exit, pthread self, get stack address, xpc copy, receive mach message, malloc, mach task save, vm copy. A lot of the stuff that you would want to have as an exploit. This sample is doing a couple of evasive measures, and one is they're actually setting the OSLog_t structure to 0. With that, they're suppressing logs that messages blaster would push out. They're using an OS transaction, and I don't have any specific evidence for that specific transaction, but I could see references for other transactions that those transactions could be a way to avoiding jetsam events. Jetsam events are happening when the iPhone gets under a lot of memory pressure and would potentially kill messages BlastPass service, so they are able to continue function. Some of the other functionality of the sample is they're reading an XPC dictionary, XPC connection, and another XPC dictionary from stack. they're sending an XPC message, they're receiving an XPC message, and they're decrypting the next stage, and after that, they're running it, and they will exit the process. So if we're looking at the overall structure, this looks like this. We're loading frameworks first, we're extracting our configs, we're checking if our device is in the config, if not, we're going to exit. Then we're loading payload C, we're not executing that one yet. Then we're checking if we prepared DL-SIM for us already, if not, we're going to prepare it. And then we're preparing the functions we want to call. We're calling payload C to retrieve the first object from the stack. We're calling it a second time to receive the connection object, and we're calling it a third time to receive the third dictionary object. Then we're using that XPC connection object to send XPC, we're receiving it, and then we're going to check if it's the right object that we want to receive. If not, we're going to exit. We're checking that object if this is actually, if it matches the key, and they're looking for a 32-byte XPC dictionary with exactly a 256-bit AES key. If that key is not matching, they're exiting again, and otherwise they're decrypting payload X, and if that is sufficient, they're going to run another N expression that I'm not able to decrypt. And afterwards, they're going to still exit messages BlastPass service with exit 5. It's not going to be exited with 0. This allows me to actually answer like a lot of the open questions. So I know that the encryption key is transported via XPC. Our theory is that they're actually sending this via iMessage, and it's one of the next XPC messages that is sent over from EM agent. But I still don't know the command and control structure, the implant, or the sandbox escape. Here's a summary of the evasive measures. And what we also found out is that the HomeKit vulnerabilities and messages BlastPass service crashes. So we're actually crashing those processes first with some kind of DOS vulnerability. So they're not going to leak the other vulnerabilities that they actually want to use later on, which is pretty smart as well. They have multiple stages. They're encrypting the sandbox escape. We were not able to recover that. Near was project 0 in the forced entry sample. On the flip side, I just have to say it's 2023 and the OPSEC is still kind of So we were able to find excessive crashes. We were able to find multiple exploit samples in the same backup. Still, there's a difference between file endings and the file name. And if you look at that PNG file, the function is just like completely standing out. That leaves us with this chain. This timeline is just for you as an overview about how long it took me to do the various kind of analysis steps, and when we also published something about this. Okay, this was just one sample. So still we could say this is one practical example, this is not working on scale. That's true. So in May 2024, we decided to launch a feature into our consumer application that allows you to upload diagnostics data. This is the same diagnostics data that I told you before. It's a sysdiagnose. And within 3 weeks, we scanned 2,500 devices. Inside of those scans, we had 2.5 Pegasus detections per 1,000 devices. If this incident rate would scale up, this means that more than 5 million devices worldwide would be infected with Pegasus. Never going to happen. I know it's a very biased sample, but still, this is a lot more than I would ever have expected. And it clearly shows if you get the right point of data, you are going to see detections if you're scanning devices which were infected. And let's get to the last and probably the most important point of the talk is how we're improving iOS malware detection. This is the state of detections in 2024. And a lot has improved compared to last year. We are seeing a lot more companies that are actually trying to generate a strategy for their targeted persons. They're going to also continue in crash log and forensic analysis. We're also seeing that there are some companies in the space now that are offering this kind of service and expertise. And at least I started a training on how to do this kind of work, so there is at least a bit of training available. Is this perfect yet? Absolutely not. Do I wish this all to be green next year? Absolutely. But it's not going to happen. On the Apple side, still the code quality and exploitation is not the issue that we have here. It lacks more on the detection side. we're not really able to do a lot of automated stuff. We need to get forensic data, which always will require a user experience. Yeah. So it's close to Christmas. That means I did my own wish list for 2025. What I really would like to see is a couple of improved Apple threat notifications. It's great that we do have these current notifications, and they're a very good starting point for an investigation, but I would love if we could see more details about the detected malware or IOCs as a starting point into that investigations. Additionally, if we would get details about the state of an attack, that means if the device was just attacked, if it's currently a running infection, or if it's a past infection, it would allow us a lot more to find out what is going on there. And timeframes or date for detections are really, really essential. If you get a 250 gigabytes backup from a person and you don't know where you need to start, you're looking into millions and millions lines. This is like searching for a very, 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 very small needle in a large, large, large haystack. This is probably the most important point, is it would be really good if we could see improvements in detection capabilities. The endpoint security framework that is available for macOS, if we would have the same thing for iOS, I could have detected every single one of the exploit samples and binaries in the last 8 years immediately on device. So it's the same data that you get on macOS that we can use for detecting the stuff on iOS, and we could have prevented many public malware infections. That BlastPass chain, after the 10 detection of a HomeKit sample crashing, I could have just restarted the device with the user, no infection. It would be also really great if we can get proper forensic access on iOS. If I'm able to extract a malware sample from memory, if I could extract that key, I can find out how the sandbox escape work. I can give this back to Apple, we can patch it, we can make all the devices more secure. But it's really, really hard to extract those samples. And a lot of the post-mortem analysis we're doing with backups is hitting a pretty much roadblock because threat actors are cleaning those up pretty much. If I would need to go to Graykey, Celebrite, or some premium service, which is only available for law enforcement, to get a full file system dump, it is just really, really hard. I also would like to say that we need to do a lot better job at collaboration and sharing on the defense side. On this specific sample, we had 4 different organizations which were working on BlastPass. This is a lot of duplicated work. And there's a lot more offensive security researchers in those companies than there's actually defensive forensic experts. If companies could start on collaboration on malware analysis, sharing of malware samples, and sharing of techniques on IOCs, we could all detect more stuff collectively, find more threats, find more exploits, patch the stuff, and make iOS better for everyone. Our current diversion on divided analysis is, in my opinion, only helping threat actors, and it's actually bad for the victims. We can be a lot more better if we actually start collaborating, and we see this on the macOS side, we see this on the Windows side where a lot of research is shared. And on a personal note, I know a couple of companies have access to malware samples. They also have talked about that. And if someone is asking me on Twitter if I'm sharing my malware samples for the good of the community, but they're not sharing theirs for the good of the community, I'm pretty much pissed. On the flip side, we will share this malware sample, and we're going to start to reach a hand out to the community. We will see how we can share it in the future and how that is going to work. It will take a couple of weeks, but we plan to share this, including a blog post and a couple of tools to analyze this. We want to be a starting point here. My very last point, I would really wish if I could get an SRD for Christmas. I still have a couple of malware samples lying on my desk, and that would definitely speed up my analysis. But in general, it would be really good if we can get a dedicated program for forensic and malware reverse engineering. A lot of this work requires deep access into iOS. I'm not a kernel exploit developer. I don't have an LPE laying around with me. If I would have one, I would report it to Apple. That means I need to have better access on iOS 18 or other operating systems in order to work on those samples, but also to do my other research. And a last iPad that is checkmateable is just not enough to do this work. Yeah. That's me.